All right, let's get started. So my name is Chris Chant. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to today's webinar, Best Practices for Advanced Lightning Apps. And today we're joined by John Bello, Director of ISV Technical Enablement for our EMEA markets here at Salesforce. He'll be speaking about best practices when designing component-based architecture for building advanced apps in the Lightning experience. And before I begin, those of us who've been to webinars or Dreamforce, you'll be familiar with our safe harbor slides. Just a quick note that when considering future developments, whether by us or with any solution provider, you should always base your purchasing decisions on the products and features that are currently available. We may be making some forward-looking statements, and we need to make that very clear in the beginning here. The key takeaway is we are a publicly traded company, and please make your buying decisions only on the products commercially available from Salesforce now. A few more items. Make sure to check us out on your social media channels. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Just search for Salesforce Developers and you'll find us. And another note on questions. Please don't wait to the end to ask your question. Our technical support team will be answering questions starting now. Please respect Q&A etiquette. Try not to repeat questions. We'll be working our way down the queue and answer your questions in the order they came in. Please stick around for live Q&A at the end of the session. And make sure if any of the questions you have asked are not answered for you today, please head over to the developer forums at developer.salesforce.com/forums. All right, and with that, we're ready to get started with today's session, Best Practices for Advanced Lightning Applications. John, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Chris. It's absolutely amazing to be here with our developer community. A couple of weeks ago, I actually had the opportunity to meet many of you in our Lightning Outdoor, taking place in London and Paris, and I was really impressed with the innovation coming out of our developer community and the whole buzz around Lightning for customers, partners, admins, and developers. I'm really looking forward to seeing many more Lightning apps out there and more standalone components in the App Exchange. Okay, so a bit more about me. I'm part of a global ISV technical enablement team that works with App Exchange or App Innovation Partners. And together with my colleagues, we actually support these partners in adopting Lightning. Not only do our partners have over 300 Lightning-ready apps on the App Exchange, but many partners are actually actively building incredible apps from the ground up for Lightning experience. And for the past 6 months, I was actually given the opportunity to work very closely with one of our partners, Sage, the leading accounting software firm for small and medium businesses, in building their Sage Live app for Lightning experience, which is available on the App Exchange. And I wanted to take this opportunity to share some best practices I learned along the way. So this is the agenda. We'll start with advanced apps for Lightning experience and what exactly does that actually mean. Then we move on to Lightning component architecture. We focus a bit on the utility bar, then on some aspects of designing for performance, and we have a quick demo at the end to just show some specific aspects. Okay, so what we talk about when we talk about advanced apps for Lightning experience. A good example is actually our Dreamhouse app, which anyone can download from our developer site. It's a beautiful, highly integrated app built from the ground up for Lightning experience. It's fully branded. It contains a number of Lightning pages, standard and custom, all customized using Lightning components. You can see a few examples here on screen. That smart home component right over there, the picture gallery further down below, and we can expand that concept a bit more. So as you can see, it also leverages the utility bar, which to me is really one of the most exciting features for Lightning experience, one of many of course, but more on the utility bar a bit later. So ultimately, advanced Lightning apps have a few things in common. They are designed from the ground up for Lightning experience. They have a relatively high number of use cases that are actually not fully supported by our standard pages and components, and therefore they don't actually conform to our recommended 80-20 rule. This said, even though we're using a lot of programmatic elements, these apps are still highly customizable by using declarative tools to determine which components are actually available where, which attributes do they have, and potentially even leveraging metadata to configure them further. You can see some examples of potential advanced Lightning apps at the bottom. So something that heavily customizes Sales Cloud, horizontal apps such as HR, accounting, vertical apps such as real estate, retail, public sector, and so on. Now, building a beautiful advanced lighting app still takes a lot of effort. So if you are the architect or lead developer in charge of actually designing this app, you need to make the most out of your budget and your resources. Fortunately, our component framework actually enables you to take advantage of component reusability, maintainability, all of this while driving performance. It's absolutely important, in my view, that you fully understand what our Lightning platform, your toolkit effectively, actually has to offer. So on the declarative side, you can create multiple apps, Lightning pages that are fully configurable, use the utility bar, and now even use Lightning components as actions. You can always use a metadata approach to have better control of how your components behave and empower your admins. And this is on top of our attribute model. On the programmatic side, everything is about events and components, standard or custom, as well as the Lightning design system, which we'd recommend to build beautiful apps more quickly. There's actually a lot of work behind a design system such as SLDS, and I've seen many partners adopting it simply because it provides so much value out of the box. Let's also not forget the Lightning Data Service that allows you to create data-driven components without any code. And finally, we still have Visualforce, which for some use cases is still a requirement, such as when generating PDF documents. Lightning requires you to really reimagine your app's user experience, and therefore the recommendation here is to master your toolkit, and you'll be able to build amazing apps in no time. Before you actually think about building your app, you really need to make sure you set yourself up for success. So that means creating a solid foundation for your app that promotes reusability, so you spend less time writing code, maintainability, so you can easily make changes, and finally, the tools to actually fine-tune your app's performance. If you are using continuous integration or have a team of developers working on a specific project or app, this is really important. So you can actually split component development across multiple environments and developers in a seamless way. So here is my personal opinion. Start by categorizing components into those that are mostly foundational. I'm calling them service components here in this table. These service components have no markup and contain code that is actually shared across most, if not all, of your other components, such as code to manage server calls or other utility functions. You may also find yourself in need of specialized components to leverage our event framework in certain scenarios, or even have components to locally store metadata. But these helper components are only used when required. Most of your time will actually be spent in creating building block components containing actual markup and underlying client-side and server-side logic, or using some of our own base Lightning components. Building block components ultimately make up experience components, which are those you will be making available in the app builder. For simpler experience components, you may want to leverage the Lightning Data Service. For more advanced components, you will ideally want to make them as dynamic as possible to work across objects and use cases. And importantly, we are planning to continue to release more base Lightning components and experience components, which should make your life easier. So let me take a minute just to recap what our release roadmap is for base Lightning components. We actually covered this during a previous developer webinar. So when building an advanced app, you will find yourself thinking whether you need to implement a certain building block or experience component. My recommendation is to attend our events to understand what our roadmap plans are, and within reason, try to remain aligned with that roadmap. Even though our plans may change, and they are always subject to our forward-looking statement, bear them in mind when prioritizing which components you should actually be focusing on in terms of creating new ones. And this can allow you, for instance, to temporarily build simple components to address a specific need, while at a later stage, when Salesforce releases a standard version of that component, replace your temporary component with it. So you don't need to worry about maintaining it going forward. If the components you need are highly customized though, it's likely that you'll need to be building some of your own, and in that case, you actually need to be ready to maintain them as required. Let's go back to that concept of a service component. So here's an example of what a service component can look like. Very simple markup with extensible equals true, so it can actually be used by other components. And one or more functions in a helper class, which components that extend it will share and override if necessary. You can, for instance, have a function that handles server requests, where you specify an Apex method in the controller, select the parameters to send to that Apex method, and then whether you want to define additional properties for your actions, such as set storable and set background. These will enable you to fine-tune how your components will call to the server, optimizing performance and managing around governor limits. Okay, so this is how you'd actually extend a service component when creating a component for the utility bar. Your utility bar component inherits the function, allowing it to reach out to its Apex controller and query data that you'll display to your users. So we have the service component being extended by the utility bar menu component, reaching out to its Apex controller, which interacts with the data on that utility bar config object. The same applies to more dynamic components, such as, say, a card list view, which could work with any S object. This means that on the server side, you are actually using dynamic Apex and SOQL, but the actual call to the server still takes place using the same function provided by the service component. Any other utility functions in the service component are also shared between these two components. So you don't need to rewrite them, you don't need to copy-paste them. Everything remains in the service component and is easy to reach and to maintain. Ultimately, if you're building an advanced app, you will need to combine our standard experience components, features such as related lists, list views, etc., with custom components that actually better suit your app's use cases. It may be that you actually need a customized version of a list view with added features that would really have a positive impact on your user's experience, or a custom form that allows your users to enter new data, or components such as the property filters in the Dreamhouse app that you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen. What is really important, however, is to maximize the reusability potential of your experience components, when possible, allowing them to work across objects and use cases. Okay, so let's imagine we have a requirement or a mockup like this for a specific component or custom experience component that we need to develop. This is an example of a custom card list view that has multi-select. You can see the checkboxes there on the left-hand side of the screen. Mass actions, the buttons on the top right-hand corner of the screen. Custom filter, you see that drop-down that says technical architect there. And it aggregates data from multiple objects, candidates, and applications. So imagine this in the context of a recruiting app. It has a lot going on, and if you're thinking about implementing it, there's a tendency to actually simply use, the Lightning Design System, add some JavaScript, and just make it work. But if you're actually building an advanced app, you actually need to step back and think across all of your components and look at your solution or app as a whole. So my first question when looking at a UX mockup of these components should be, firstly, how can I make it reusable? And secondly, how can I reuse stuff I already have to build it? I know this component has a header, a table, and a footer. And these are all similar to what I'd find in other components, such as list views, related lists, and card list views for other objects. So if I have a need to develop components with that level of customization, I think there's a lot of reusability potential. So I need to find opportunities to reuse all of these sections as individual building block components. Getting into more detail, I can also find opportunities to use our base lighting components, a button group on the top right corner, button menus for each row, and formatted numbers and dates. If I really want to go down the route of making components dynamic to fit multiple formats and objects, which ultimately accelerate the development of my advanced app, I should also find opportunities to define and use component metadata that drives the behavior for specific use cases. This metadata can be stored in custom objects or, ideally, custom metadata types. Examples include for this component which actions should be available, so that I don't need to display all actions, which columns to display, and the query that actually drives the data. At the app builder level, I limit attributes to ones that make life easier for admins, such as what should be the title, how many rows of data should be displayed, and whether I need pagination. And finally, I connect an app builder attribute to a metadata record. So it's really up to you to determine the best combination of metadata and attributes and whether or not to use metadata at all. So this is a suggestion if you want to have a certain degree of customization that's based on metadata. Let's now look at an example of the component tree for this proposed car list view component. So we start with a high-level component that's available in the app builder. It has a certain attributes that are available to admins that configure that component through the app builder, and includes a reference to a metadata record. It includes a generic list view component that can actually render different types of list views, including car list views, full list views, and say a related list, for instance. So I'm actually passing information to that component saying, okay, which type of list view I actually want to render, and there will also be event handling logic at this level to handle UI events. This component includes three different sections. So a header, where I'll focus on understanding whether I need to render any specific filters, which fast actions are available, a table, and a footer. The header will likely contain base lighting components for the button group, which will display and fire mass actions. The footer will actually allow me to define whether I need, for instance, pagination, which is that component right over there. And that pagination component can fire events saying, okay, please, let's navigate to the next page, and so on, and therefore we need to refresh the data. The actual table, the first component asks a question around what data should actually be rendered and which actions should be available for that data set. Then we have a component that actually renders the data and the actions and provides the record selection logic. It includes a number of output fields, which render what the user is actually seeing for a particular record, and uses the lightning button menu-based component to display and fire record level actions. The output field is further broken down into UI and lightning namespace components for the various types of output fields it can actually render, and potentially even a custom a custom component to render things like links to Visualforce pages, record home pages, and so on and so on. Finally, we can also see how bubbling up an event from an example component such as the pagination component would actually work. So if I were to fire a pagination event from that particular component, it will bubble up, going up to the footer level and all the way up to generic list view, where it will be handled, and the data will then be refreshed by handling that particular event. And this is a component level event. So when you're building advanced experience components that combine custom features with standard Salesforce functionality, you will want your components to work as seamlessly as our standard components. In the previous example, we saw that we use platform actions in our car list view. So how do we actually execute them from our custom experience component? First, we have two options. We either pre-select which actions to display for a certain record using metadata, or we simply display all available actions for that particular context. We can query them using the platform action object in Apex, which will also allow us to get information on which type of action it actually is. From this, we can then fire all action types, standard actions using standard Lightning Experience events, Visual Force actions by redirecting to their URL, such as when you're printing a PDF, for instance, and Lightning actions when you have a specific component you actually want to display. In this case, one solution can be to display a modal, dynamically inject your Lightning component, and pass the appropriate parameters. So this Lightning action could be used in both standard components and custom components. Now let's move on to one of my favorite Lightning Experience features, which is the utility bar. I really like the utility bar because for the first time, we have one or more components that are always available wherever you may be in your app. And this is really an incredible opportunity to rethink your app's user experience. More importantly, in Spring 17, the utility bar is actually fully configurable through the setup user interface, which I'll be demoing in a few minutes. And typical use cases for the utility bar include CTI, a dynamic navigation menu, a contextual help menu, global actions, and so on. In our Dreamhouse app, we actually have an example of a mortgage calculator. I've seen other creative ideas out there though, so imagine using hidden components within the utility bar as a cache either for the whole app or for data within the utility bar itself. Given that the utility bar is persistently available, that opens up a lot of possibilities. And I think it opens up possibilities for customers and partners to really leverage this new user experience and rethink how your app can incorporate the utility bar within itself. Now, let's discuss how we can actually incorporate dynamic content in the utility bar. Let's imagine that we have a contextual help menu in the utility bar. If I click the help button on my card list view, I will fire an application event. This event is handled by the utility bar component, which loads the appropriate help text from the server. It gets more interesting if your component is actually smart enough not to call to the server if it already contains the data it needs. Or if this data is even preloaded. Preloading the data means that you don't actually need to call to the server at all. You can actually load all of that data even before the user interacts with the utility bar. And therefore, the utility bar already contains all the data it actually requires. And out of all of this, how do we keep thinking about performance while we are building our advanced app? One challenge that may occur if you use advanced experience components is that they have a tendency to be quite chatty, with multiple calls to server taking place. It's not difficult to actually have 3 or 4 components on the same page and hitting the governor limit on the number of SOQL queries when loading a page. And this is mainly because we aggregate all calls into a single Apex transaction. But there are a few strategies to get around this. First of all, if you have the opportunity to use the Lightning Data Service, you should really use it. The Lightning Data Service will not count towards any SOQL limits or any other governor limits, actually. Within reason, use cache data. So let's imagine that you have static data or metadata that you need to load into the utility bar, into other components. Within reason, try to do that, which will prevent a lot of chattiness once the component is actually loaded. Leverage custom metadata types that do not count against SOQL limits. Use set background on calls to the server. And that's why it's so important in your service component to provide the ability for selected actions to set this particular option. This allows calls to be processed separately, and it's generally designed for lower priority calls, but it's generally processed quickly. So if you find yourself having a lot of calls to the server, try using set background and check what the actual impact is. Finally, another option is to actually chain component loading by groups. This means that I can actually select the first group of components to load, followed by a second group of components, a third, and so on and so on. And each of these groups will fall under its own Apex transaction. And ultimately, we are chaining the loading of the second group once we actually get the response from the server in terms of the data for the first group. So we fire all of those events in chain. Some performance best practices. When testing for performance, make sure that you've enabled the secure cache and that Locker service is enabled as well, and that you disable Lightning Components debugging. So this will make the environment optimal for testing against performance. And then you can, throughout the design process of actually developing your app, think about opportunities for using lazy loading, so that data is only loaded upon user intervention. Whenever possible, actually try to preload data. So for instance, imagine data in the utility bar. There's an opportunity to actually load data in the background once the app actually starts. So when you click the refresh button, for instance, that data is loaded, and it's there waiting for the user to actually interact with it. And this is especially valuable for static data or metadata that your components actually depend on. Use set storable on calls to the server. Set storable basically stores a local copy of the data whenever you make a call to the server. Meaning in future calls, we will use the locally stored copy, which is on the client, while a separate call to the server takes place to actually obtain a refreshed copy of that data. So the performance will be better and the user experience will generally be better as well. And I'll show you a specific example of set storable in use in a second. Finally, find opportunities to implement some sort of data or like a Lightning component for metadata and data that actually remains static, which is basically configuration data that is very unlikely to change during the actual app's usage. And therefore, you don't need to always be querying the server for it. Just focus on having that data stored in the client side and use it when possible. So let's now run through a quick demo where I wanted to cover a couple of topics. Let me just open my Lightning experience here. Okay, so I have my single page recruitment app, and this is of course just for the sake of this particular demo. We have a couple of card list view components similar to the ones we were discussing earlier. And one thing that I want to do is to implement contextual help for this particular page within my app. And you can imagine that the actual app would have many more tabs with many more components with a greater degree of complexity. So this is actually a Spring 17 pre-release environment that actually allows me to configure the utility bar through the setup UI. So if I actually go into my setup menu, you'll notice that the setup actually opens in a separate tab in Spring 17. I go into apps and I click on the app manager. I then open my app, and you can see that we now have a utility bar section right here. In the utility bar, I can add a number of standard components, as you can see here. or you can add obviously a number of custom components. In this case, I will be adding my nav assistant component, which I'll just call assistant. Let's put here the icon called emoji. I can define the panel width and height, and I'll define it as 240. I can ensure that the component associated with this particular section of the utility bar is loaded when the app actually opens, and whether the panel that displays the component is scrollable. So I'll click Save, click Done, and I've added that component to the utility bar. So if I go back to my page and actually refresh it, you'll see that utility bar is actually rendered. And what I've done in that particular component in the utility bar is to display contextual help for each of these two components. So you'll see that I actually have a utility bar configuration object right here associated against each component. So I'm basically using this as metadata for that particular utility bar. So if I click on the help icon on the candidate component, I will see this particular help text. If I do the same on the positions components, I will see a different help text. Now let me go back here, click into Recruitment tab, and I'll open up the assistant, which will remain open while I click on the help buttons. And I want you to pay attention on how quickly the text that will be displayed in the utility bar actually loads. So I'm going to start by clicking on the candidates component here, and you'll see that there's just a tiny delay, and this is because I've actually implemented a component in the utility bar that actually is calling out to server to get data. So I did not preload any data at all. So from the perspective of a user actually using this, I may actually benefit from having the data preloaded in the first time when I actually open the app. If I move on and click on the positions component, you'll see a similar delay. However, these calls to the server are defined as set storable. This means that if I actually click on the candidates component again, you'll see that there's basically no delay at all because I'm using a locally cached version of that data. I click there and I get an immediate response, and same goes for positions. So whenever you're building components, again, think about how you can optimize server calls so that you drive a much better user experience. Having a service component that allows you to fine-tune this for specific components will just make your life easier at the end of the day. Let me just close this. One other thing that I just wanted to quickly cover is how we can manage around SOQL limits. So I actually created a component, and I'll just open this page here, a component that actually executes 20 SOQL queries. I think it's probably executing them against a standard object such as account. And what it also does is to check what the limit for that particular transaction actually is at that point in time. So you'll see that I have 5 components assigned against group 1, and depending on how the transactions actually execute on the Apex side, one of them actually discovers that we've just reached a limit, which is 100 here, and the others, for every execution, will sit with a different number. So the first 20 rows will actually be assigned to group 1, and so on, and so on, and so on. Now, the issue is that if I were to keep all of these components assigned to the same group, I would hit a SOQL limit. If I was to be monitoring the developer console, I would be seeing that error, right? So what I'm doing here is to fire off an application event when group 1 actually finishes loading, allowing me to load group 2. And group 2, you'll see, has monitored a separate set of limits. And the same goes for group 3 and group 4. I'll just click on this page again, so you can see the execution from the top of the page going all the way down to the page as the various components actually load. So it starts rendering with group 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's pretty fast, but this is just one out of many tools that actually allow you to fine-tune how your components will actually load. Again, look at using properties such as set background when you're making your calls to the server, and actually avoid making calls to the server. Try to preload data whenever possible and maximize your user experience. So in terms of the demo, that's it. That's actually it for me. So we'll just run over a few additional slides, starting with this, Chris, and then we can kick off the Q&A.
Great, thanks, John. That was a great presentation. We've got a lot of excellent questions that we'll be getting to momentarily. As you can see, if you're in the New York City area, we're actually kicking off our Salesforce World Tour. It'll be in New York City on December 15th, and you can get more information at that URL below, www.salesforce.com/events/worldtour/NYC. We are also collecting information about a survey. We'd love to hear how you thought this webinar went. Your feedback really helps us make sure we provide you relevant content and about topics that you're interested in. So you can check out our survey at bit.ly/bestlightning. We'd really appreciate your feedback. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get into Q&A. And for those of you who don't know, please check out Trailhead. Trailhead is the fun way to learn Salesforce. You can see that at trailhead.salesforce.com. Or feel free to tweet at us. We are at Salesforce Devs. And of course, if any questions don't get answered today, please join us on the developer forums on developer.salesforce.com/forums and ask any questions that we don't get to here. And with that, John, I've got a bunch of great questions that I'm going to throw your way.
Perfect. So let me just quickly stop sharing my screen so I can actually look at the questions while.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. So for our first question, John, we have a question about implementing swipe and gesture functionality for Salesforce 1 using Lightning components. I'm not sure if we'll be able to answer that one, but do you know, is that possible?
Yes, it is possible. I actually had one of my partners asking me the same question. The feedback I got was that it is possible, but it requires you to implement your own custom events to be able to handle that.
Great, thanks.
That's my current understanding.
Perfect. So the next question is asking about one of the slides we saw earlier, where we say that in general, advanced Lightning apps do not follow the 80-20 rule of declarative versus programmatic coding. Is more coding expected in advanced Lightning apps?
Yeah, I would say so. So going back to that concept of an advanced Lightning app, what we're talking about here are apps that are heavily customized. So think about an app for accounting, such as the one that Sage has been focusing on. That app has very specific use cases, and those components have been built to deal with data in a very particular way. For instance, often we see the same object being used for a very wide number of different purposes, and we need to have an extra layer of logic to be able to differentiate between those. So when we have an app that has that degree of complexity, we will be building a lot of components in order to actually support those advanced use cases. So more coding is certainly expected, but again, this is all about what your use cases actually are. In many instances, our standard components will be more than enough, and we continue to recommend our 80-20 rule for most developments. If you are leaning towards having more complex use cases, you may need to prepare to actually build components. And if you do that, again, think about some of the points I was making earlier. making sure that your components are highly reusable. So you don't need to spend time repeating the same kind of logic. Just build a component to deal with tables, build a component to deal with creating a header or a footer, and allow it to be dynamic enough to adapt to a number of different use cases, to a number of different objects, and that will ultimately make your life easier, and it will make life easier for the developers in your team.
Awesome, thank you. So there's a question about sending out a link to the code that we covered today. I'm not sure if, maybe perhaps you can correct me, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to do that. What I will refer our viewers to is the Dreamhouse sample app, which is available at dreamhouseapp.io. We'll send a link to that out in the follow-up email to this webinar. But that being said, John, is it going to be possible for us to share some of the code today? I was under the impression that we were not able to, but I'm hoping maybe you can prove me wrong.
Well, no, I don't think we need to be looking at that particular code. I mean, there are a few things that I can certainly share, but from our perspective in terms of Salesforce and the dev evangelist effort around Lightning, we are building a lot of content. And I understand, for instance, people like Greg Ruiz are actually creating even trailheads around Lightning, where you will see a lot of example code.
That's a great point. And of course, the URL for Trailhead is trailhead.salesforce.com. Tons of great content around Lightning app development there. So here we have a question I think we hear a lot. Is it possible to build an app for both Classic and Lightning?
Yeah, and it's actually something that on the partner side we tend to recommend, because partners are building apps that will be used not only by those customers that are actively using Lightning Experience, and we have many more of them right now, but there are still customers that, due to many reasons, have not yet made the transition into Lightning. So we do need to support both scenarios, right? We already have some content out there around how you can actually restyle your app to work both in Lightning Experience and in Classic. So, for instance, using the Lightning Design System when operating in Lightning Experience, using the Classic design when you're operating Salesforce Classic, and this is typically better applied to Visualforce pages. This said, when you're building an app for Lightning Experience and also supporting Classic at the same time, think about opportunities to actually build Lightning components that can be surfaced within Visualforce pages in Classic. This is, again, a matter of trying to reuse code, right? So if you're building, say, a new version of your app that will contain a lot of Lightning components, why not actually exposing those components in Visualforce pages in Salesforce Classic, so that Classic users can actually interact with those components, which can be easily surfaced through a Visualforce page.
Awesome, thanks. So this question came up during the dynamic content screen. The question was, are the actions available to be executed via code, or do you need some sort of user interaction? And just to refer back, I think that was...
I understand what you mean. Our actions should be executed by a user. We don't currently support executing our standard actions via code in that fashion, right? So we would expect, say, a user to click on a specific button which fires, say, a standard action, a Visualforce action, or a Lightning action. So we can't actually programmatically fire off something like that without some sort of user intervention, as far as I understand.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. And the next question is, it's about application events, and the question is, don't we need to minimize the use of application events for performance reasons?
Well, it depends on how many events we're actually talking about. Issues in general minimize events. It should minimize SOQL queries. It should minimize Apex code running on server side. It should ultimately even minimize the number of components on a page. But this is all about fine-tuning and figuring out how your app will best perform in Lightning Experience. So there's some work to be done when you're actually designing and building your app in terms of finding out how it actually best performs. So look at some of the the suggestions I made around trying to test your app for performance, because there's a lot you can do to actually make your app really, really fast.
Awesome, thanks. So the next question is about view state, and the question is view state also available when debugging the size of a Lightning page?
No, we don't actually have that concept for Lightning, but you can definitely use.
Follow up. There's actually several questions in a row, so I'm just going to go ahead and try to ask all of them. This question was in reference to the SOQL queries limit slide, and the question is there a way to know what operations are taking the longest?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, there is. I mean, use the Lightning inspector. It provides a lot of information around what exactly is taking longer. Also, look at the developer console, which will provide you information on how transactions are actually being split between database, Apex, that kind of stuff, and fine-tune your app. Again, if you're building an app that deals with, say, large volumes of data, complex user interactions, you will need to spend some time fine-tuning it. So be comfortable with those tools. Invest some time in actually understanding them. I believe we already have some good materials on how to use those tools. I think I just lost Chris there for a second, but I see some additional questions here. So, someone new to Lightning, utility bar. When you add the icon, you type the emoji. Is there any way I can select from a list of icons, or every time I have to use such keywords? If yes, then where we will get a list of such keywords? Actually, I can actually show you. This is actually really, really easy. So we actually have the link in the actual setup menu. So in Lightning Design System, we have a number of icons, right? And those icons have a specific name associated against them. So if I actually go into my app again, okay, go into my app definition. Here we go. Utility bar. You'll see this link here, right? So Lightning Design System utility icon. Let me just open that in a new tab. And that takes me to the list of icons that can be used within the utility bar. And there are quite a few of them, right? So hopefully these will allow you to configure icons for your particular use case. Sorry, I just noticed I wasn't actually sharing my screen, so let me just share that quickly. So again, going back to the utility bar manager, there's a link here to a page in the Lightning Design System that allows me to interact with these, to understand which icons are there and the names associated against them. And I see my team is still experiencing some technical difficulties. Okay, that's fine. We will keep on going through the questions. Let me just stop sharing my screen. Okay. Can the utility bar component stay present in the setup screens? Would assist with product installation and configuration. Well, in the winter release, it was certainly available in the setup screens. I think we've actually moved away from that. But feel free to test it in a pre-release environment. If you are happy with current setup, that's fine. If not, please provide us feedback. Getting some background noise from my colleagues, I think. Okay, I think that's now sorted. So let me continue through the questions. How to perform custom mass operation on list view of a standard object? Well, if this is around providing mass actions on a list view, I mean, I think you need to check whether that's already available now. I'm not completely familiar with whether that's available now or whether it's a roadmap item that we are potentially looking into. Is there any way to programmatically access metadata attributes from the design page using the Lightning Page Builder? I mean, generally, what happens is that you use a Lightning component attribute to reference some sort of ID on the metadata side. Currently, we don't have a means of actually connecting the two automatically together. Just continuing through the list again. How does local caching impact building and debugging components? Do any changes automatically cause the local cache to be invalidated, or do we need to do something special? It depends on how you're actually managing that cache. If we're talking about something like a custom component that you've implemented for that purpose, when that component is destroyed, the cache will go away. And this can happen, say, when you refresh the page or when there's some specific action on the page that actually destroys that component. And it's pretty similar to when using something like set storable. If you refresh the page, that cache will go away. But that's, in terms of set storable, you can easily turn it off, and you can manage around that. Now, there are so many questions. I'm just at the beginning of the question list. So just to recap very quickly, we will be going through all of the various questions, and we will be spending some time answering them while you guys are, because I understand we won't have time to actually cover all of them. But let me try to maximize the next 6 minutes or so to get you some more answers. Is it possible to switch the user to Lightning Experience, and when the user clicks on a certain app, switch the user back to Classic when they move to a different app? We don't support that at the moment. I mean, automatically transitioning a user from Lightning to Classic programmatically or something like that. We do that for some of our own standard action. I think that for some reason may still need to be done using Salesforce Classic, but we're not currently exposing that functionality as far as I'm aware. Are mass actions available for Lightning components with the implementation Force Community available for all page types? I'm not entirely sure whether in a community context you'd have access to actions. This will require a bit more research, I think. Okay. When to use the set storable method? Well, ideally, you want to use it when you want your users to see a locally cached copy of the data before you actually call out to the server. As you saw in that particular example in the utility bar. So I want my users to be able to see the contextual help more quickly, for instance, rather than waiting for a call to the server to take place every single time. Will Salesforce provide common use case templates that can be customized further? We are certainly very focused on providing more enablement content around Lightning and Lightning components in general. Whether they will specifically be these ones that are identified here, I'm not entirely sure.
Hey, John, this is Chris again. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Hey,
I've been answering questions while you guys have had some technical difficulties, I understand.
Yes, thank you so much. I apologize for that. Sorry, with you, I'll go ahead and kick off and continue with our running down the list. I'll give you more of an opportunity to think about the questions rather than dealing with the spreadsheet as well.
No, that's fine. I'm actually doing that right now. So let me see where I am. Can we make utility bar data static every time, or is there any specific use case for that? Yeah, there are certainly specific use cases to make it static if you need it to be static, right? Or if you need to interact with static data. In a case like that, I would simply try to preload data into the utility bar once the app actually loads, and then when users actually interact with the utility bar, the data is already there. I mean, you need to test it and understand whether there's any specific issues with that in your particular app. What was the Dreamhouse address again? Are we able to share the Dreamhouse URL in the chat?
Absolutely. I'll go ahead and get to that right now.
Perfect. Thank you. Can you elaborate a bit on how the Dreamhouse app has integrated Einstein? Personally, I won't be able to, but I hope that when you actually download the app and play around with it, you may get some more details on that. Was Lightning Data Service released in Winter 16? Actually, our current release is Winter 17. Lightning Data Service is currently in developer preview. I believe it will be available either as a beta or GA in spring. Not entirely sure exactly which will be the status, but I believe we are expanding its usage now for spring 17. What is your development environment or the editor you use for Lightning development? Actually, we have quite a few IDEs available today. Personally, I've seen partners using Sublime, using Cloud9, using Eclipse, and using other IDEs that are out there for Lightning development. To be honest, I don't know all of them by heart, but there are quite a few. So research, asking the community, and people will be able to guide you in that direction. What's the advantage of using Lightning over another front-end framework like Angular? If something is built in Angular, that is a very easy way to bounce between Classic and Lightning. Well, Lightning Experience does provide a lot of standard functionality that you will be missing out if you're stuck in Lightning using a Visualforce page where you're exposing your Angular components. So my recommendation would be really to try to use Lightning components wherever possible, unless you already have built a lot of code in Angular that you need to actually expose either into Classic or Lightning Experience. But Lightning components will have a lot of advantages. We, from our side, are really focused on providing more base Lightning components for you to use in your custom components, which will make your development process easier.
Hey, John, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're basically at time here. I just wanted to see, do we have a few more minutes? Can we go over and continue answering questions, or do we need to wrap this one up at 11?
I can go for a few more minutes. I'm fine with that. We also had that small break, so we can kind of compensate for that.
Awesome. All right. Well, all right, folks, on the webinar, we'll go for about 10 more minutes. Thank you.
Perfect. So I created a custom button and a custom Lightning view using the Lightning App Builder. I want that button to navigate to this view. How will that work? Well, I believe if you're mentioning navigating from a custom button into a specific Lightning page, we don't currently support navigating into a Lightning page. We do support navigating into a Visualforce page, which you can use as a wrapper for Lightning components if you need to do that kind of navigation. But this is something we are looking into to see if we can provide that routing ability for you guys to be able to navigate to Lightning pages. Are there plans to make more advanced design attributes for components, for instance, setting up components in App Builder, where the component may do a lookup to retrieve possible options for the data source? I'm not fully aware of our roadmap for App Builder. I'm sure that we will continue to make improvements to it. So stay tuned. Look at what we'll be delivering in the coming releases, and maybe it'll be in line with this. Do you know if Jenkins and automated testing is compatible as well with Lightning components? Yes, I've actually seen partners implementing Selenium to do UI level testing with Lightning components, so that is certainly feasible. And we actually do a lot of UI testing ourselves in terms of Lightning components. So if this is something that's important to you, because this is still a lot of effort, right, then it is certainly possible. Can I take advantage of the utility bar in the Salesforce Classic view where the Lightning components are invoked via Lightning out from the Visual Force page? Unfortunately not, but there's nothing stopping you from using the component that you typically associate against the utility bar and just exposing it in Visual Force. I mean, it is a Lightning component at the end of the day, so you can expose it in Visual Force. You cannot expose the actual UI of the utility bar, but the component itself can certainly be exposed. I get no component named record preview found when trying to use the force record preview for implementing Lightning Data Service. Well, as far as I understand, we're actually changing the nomenclature of some of our Lightning Data Service components in Spring, and that's why we actually kept it as a developer preview in winter. So you will find that there are some changes to that particular nomenclature we are using for Lightning Data Service components. I saw input search in the presentation, but it is not currently in the Spring 17 org. Any knowledge on when this will be available in pre-release? And you're saying that you're kind of relying on Oradocs to check whether this component is available. I would personally not rely directly on Oradocs. I think I would actually try to implement it as soon as we have the release notes out, the draft release notes, and check whether that component is actually available. I'm not completely familiar with, or actually I don't know by heart which components will actually be releasing. I mean, I did have a slide on that, but as soon as we have more detail on using the release notes, please look at that. How can we migrate existing apps containing Visual Force to Lightning? So this is the important question, right? So we have built our apps using Visual Force for quite a few years. How do we actually migrate them into Lightning? And this can potentially be a significant effort. So we need to approach this carefully and with in a gradual way, right? What we recommend is to first think about opportunities for restyling Visual Force pages. For instance, detecting when Visual Force pages are actually running in Classic versus when they are running in Lightning Experience, and we do provide methods for that. And potentially using Lightning Design System when running in Lightning Experience, and so on and so on. So that's the restyling discussion, right? And then find opportunities to actually componentize your Visual Force pages. You can even start by using Visual Force components, and that's the starting point. And then actually incorporate Lightning components within the Visual Force pages. From there, whenever you're ready, fully migrate those components into, say, a Lightning page within Lightning Experience, and so on and so on. So try to find a gradual mechanism to actually migrate to Lightning. You will find it probably easier to leverage our base Lightning components if you're using a lot of our standard Visual Force components, which kind of mimic the Salesforce Classic UI. So stay tuned in terms of our roadmap for base Lightning components and how that can actually simplify that transition as we move forward. Why should we disable the debugging level in Lightning components? The recommendation there is simply when you're doing performance tests. So you can actually test your app in a state that's very similar to production. So how a user would actually be interacting with the app. The debugging, when we turn on debugging, there are a few things that we do in the background that make it easier for you to debug, and therefore they do not have certain optimizations that we actually incorporate when the debugging is turned off. How about unit tests for Lightning components? Well, as far as I understand, we are working on a testing framework for Lightning components. This is a really important feature that has been requested by partners and by customers. As far as I understand, I think we are aiming to potentially have something available for you guys to play around with in summer. I'm not entirely sure whether in spring we will already have something, so stay tuned because we understand the importance of it. Any plans to extend the record list components so we can enhance them for custom use cases? I don't believe we have any particular plans for this. Again, we may be releasing base Lightning components that will allow you to customize them a bit further.
And I think this is our last question, John.
Is it? Okay. Okay. Oh, perfect. Okay. So why to enable locker service for managed package? So you may be referring to a new checkbox that allows you to test locker service for managed packages. This is actually mostly for our App Exchange partners to actually test their app against locker service. This is when that checkbox becomes more relevant, because at this stage we're actually not enforcing locker service on managed packages. Even if you turn on locker service in your org, managed packages will not be running under locker service at this stage unless you actually tick that checkbox. And the purpose of that is to allow our partners to actually take their time to test their apps against locker, ensure they are compliant with locker service. And once they are, and I believe our goal is to actually enforce locker service across customers and partners by, I believe, summer. Once we get that stage, locker will be activated for everyone, and all the apps, customer and partner alike, need to be compliant. Right now, it's more of a mechanism that allows partners to actually test their apps against locker service without impacting customer experience.
Awesome. And that was our last question, John. Thank you so much for the great presentation today. And I apologize to our webinar participants who experienced our technical difficulties. We'll try to do better in the future. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. If we didn't get to your specific question, which I think we got to most of them, please reach out to us in the developer forums. Again, the URL is developer.salesforce.com/forums. And please enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.